My name is Cheikh Mbow. I am the Director General of Centre de Suivi Ecologique, Ecological Monitoring Center, a center of excellence in West Africa based in Dakar. I worked before for many international organizations in Kenya and South Africa and US. Responding to climate change could be a reality in the context of Africa. The first one is the funding. And when we talk about funding, we are not necessarily looking for imported funding or funding sourced in Europe or United States. We're looking for funding which are connected to the national budget for adaptation. Often when you see policies on climate change in Africa, the climate change policy does not come as a single alone policy. It's nested to different other areas, sectoral areas, on water, on agriculture, on urban, etc. But more often they don't have the right insights to be able to calibrate the interventions based on the need of communities. And the importance of science is to bring the evidence on how climate change can affect the different sectoral policies and how we can reverse the linkages between the policies and the climate change responses on the ground. And that needs a domestic funding, that needs domestic budgeting, that needs reducing the gap between the investment that the countries are doing for development and the necessary endowment that they need for climate change. But then again, climate change is a global issue, and adaptation is something which country has, committed themselves to funding through the Green Climate Fund, through the Adaptation Fund, and many other windows. But yet, the funding which should be available to Africa to address the climate change issues is not yet there. Or if it is, it's very hard to crack for them to access it. Most particularly, the communities on the ground, they do not know how to mount a climate adaptation program for their own transformation. And therefore, the funding brings the second point, which is to me extremely important, is the issues of planning climate change into local development needs. Very few resources are available to support climate science and vision into local planning. And unless we do those planned intervention into local communities adaptation, the reality of creating a solid background in terms of adaptation will be missing into the local transformation that we need. So our plea here is how to improve local planning in local budgeting, how we improve local uptake of knowledge to improve communities' adaptation plan at local level. The third tier, which is to me quite critical, after the funding, after the planning, the third tier is delivery, is upscaling, is making sure that the good practices are being supported and replicated in various places in order to create the deep and rapid social transformation that Africa needs to adapt to climate change. And unless we do those three things, which to me are the starting block, are the must-have initial steps, we will not be resolving the issues of climate change in the long run. The most important is to know that science, as written in papers, is not carrying the most important aspirations of communities or the practices that we have in Africa. There are a number of practices which are not documented. There is a number of behavior and projection between communities and the response need on climate change which is nowhere to be seen on papers. You only see it on the ground. So unless you do that effort to capture what communities do to survive, to be resilient, to be adapted to climate change, you're missing the issues of what works, and you're missing also what could work in very similar settings when you observe it in one context as compared to the other. So my presentation was to showcase the neglected practice, the neglected plans, the neglected rules, the neglected social behavior that altogether will be a package of response that is very hard to find in separate papers which are very targeted based on the discipline, what they need to achieve on the ground. So the second point which we want to make is that African negative rhetoric is counterproductive. There is a lot of resources in Africa. There is a lot of potential. And the fact of untapping this potential, with all the neglected practices and resources that we mentioned. Unless we do that, adaptation will not be a possibility in Africa. We need to rely on our resource, we need to rely on our people, and we need to rely on our land. That's where we will trickle, we will accelerate the social transformation that we have. So imported solutions, imported rhetoric will not help. Let's build the narrative in Africa. Let's have a bottom-up approach, and let's use the resources for communities to be transformed.